What was Lord Horatio Nelson's first famous disobedience? We look at a great example of mission command at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, February 14, 1797.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 52 of the Principles of War podcast, as we continue our studies into Lord Horatio Nelson, as we look for insights into his leadership style and how he was able to engender mission command through his superiors, his peers, and his subordinates. Today we're looking at the events at Cape St. Vincent on the 14th of February, 1797, when Nelson was particularly eager to give the Spanish under José de Córdoba a Valentine's Day that they would never forget. Now, to catch you up with what's been going on in Nelson's life since our last episode, he's had about 5 years on the reserve list on half pay, given the fact that the British were at peace. Then a war with the French came, and he has been sailing around for about 4 years. If you listen to the last episode, you'll be aware that he wasn't afraid of ordering the cat o' nine tails out fairly frequently with his crew, and morale may not have been as good as it could have been. However, maybe the time that he's had off has given him some time to reflect on his leadership style, and maybe he's learned a little bit more in the intervening 4 years that they've been at war. As we look at some of the battles in which he fought, we're going to be looking for some of the examples about how he managed his crew, because I think there's some good insights that we can all learn from with his leadership style there. The Treaty of Ildefonso in 1796 allied the Spanish and French against Great Britain. The Franco-Spanish fleet outnumbered the British Mediterranean fleet, and they evacuated Corsica and then Elba. On the 1st of February, 1797, Don José Córdoba is commanding a Spanish fleet, and it leaves from Cartagena to Cadiz, and it was blown off course by a fierce levanta, which is an easterly wind, and it was blown further out into the Atlantic. Robert Southey's book, The Life of Nelson, describes the forces that were about to meet. The British force consisted of 2 ships of 100 guns, 2 of 98, 2 of 90, 8 of 74 and 1 64. 15 of the line in all, with 4 frigates, a sloop and a cutter. The Spaniards had 1 4-decker of 136 guns, 6 3-deckers of 112, 2 84s, 18 74s, so in all 27 ships of the line with 10 frigates and a brig. The Spaniards had 7 ships that were bigger than any of the other British ships. So not only numerical supremacy, but the ships were significantly bigger as well. Admiral José de Córdoba had learnt from an American on the 5th that the English had only 9 ships, which was indeed the case when his informer had seen them, for a reinforcement of 5 ships from England under Admiral Parker had not joined them at that stage. Southey continues, upon this information, the Spanish commander, instead of going back into Cadiz, as was his intention, was determined to seek an enemy so inferior in force, and relying with fatal confidence upon the American account, he suffered his ships to remain too far dispersed and in some disorder. When the morning of the 14th broke and discovered the English fleet, a fog for some time concealed their number. It was Commodore Horatio Nelson at this stage in his career who had discovered the location of the Spanish fleet. He had been sailing out to join Admiral Sir John Jervis's fleet, and he'd been able to slip through the Spanish fleet in one of the fogs that had obscured the size of the fleet. John Jervis is quite an interesting character. He rose to be Admiral of the fleet, and his greatest victory was to be here at Cape St. Vincent. In fact, he would be given the title the first Earl of St. Vincent after this victory. He had a reputation as a stern disciplinarian, but despite that, his nickname with his crews was Old Jarvie, and they had great affection for him. John Campbell's book, The Lives of British Admirals and the Naval History of Great Britain, paints an interesting picture of Jarvis. After the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, he was ordered back out to sea to quell a mutiny, and he hoisted his flag in the Ville de Paris and took command of the Channel Fleet. His remarkable benevolence is manifested in a circumstance which occurred at this period. One day, the ship's company were ordered to bathe. On returning to their duty, Lord St. Vincent observed a favourite seaman in tears and surrounded by a group of his comrades. He called to his secretary and said, "There's my delight, Roger Odell in tears. Go see what's the matter." It turned out that Roger had jumped off the foreyard with his trousers on and had forgotten that all he's possessed in the world consisted of banknotes in one of the pockets. The water reduced them to useless pulp. The Admiral went into his cabin, but presently returned and ordered all hands to be turned out. Odell was summoned, and the Admiral, assuming one of his angry looks, thus addressed him, "Roger Odell, you are convicted, sir, by your own appearance, of tarnishing the British oak with tears. What have you to say?" The poor fellow, overpowered by his distress, could only plead that he had lost all that he had in the world, and that he had been many years saving it, and that he could not help crying a little. The Admiral, still preserving his look of displeasure, said, "The loss of money, sir, can never be an excuse for a British seaman for tears." Then, softening down his tone, he proceeded, "Roger Odell, you're one of the best men in the ship. In my life, I never saw a man behave better in battle than you. In the victory, did in the action with the Spanish fleet. To show, therefore, that your Commander-in-Chief will never pass over merit, wheresoever he may find it, there is your money, sir," giving him £70. "But no more tears, mind, no more tears." The poor fellow, holding the notes in his hand, astonished and confused, but becoming sensible to the reality, gave in a hurried manner, "Thank ye, my lord, thank ye," and dived down below to conceal a fresh gush of tears of gratitude. That's a not insignificant act of gratitude there from Admiral Jarvis. That works out to be just over £3,000 in today's money. Jarvis was, however, a harsh disciplinarian. It is important, though, to put that in some context. 1797 was the year of the Spithead and Nore mutinies. Two mutinies, significant mutinies, while Britain was at war. The two mutinies, though, had significantly different causes. The Spithead Mutiny started out with 16 ships in the Channel Fleet that were protesting against the living conditions aboard the vessels. Pay had been the same for a significant amount of time. There'd been inflation because of the war, and rations and changing conditions on the ships had led to increasing disgruntlement amongst the seamen. The situation worsened a month later when a further 15 ships in Plymouth sent delegates to Spithead to join in the negotiations. Admiral Lord Howe eventually was able to negotiate with the mutineers and saw that there was a royal pardon issued for all of the crews, reassignment of some of the unpopular officers, and paying conditions were improved on the ships. The Nore is an anchorage at the mouth of the River Thames. Ships there, emboldened by what had happened at Spithead, also mutinied. One of the seamen, Richard Parker, was elected President of the Delegates of the Fleet, and demands were sent to Admiral Charles Buckner. These predominantly were around pardons, better conditions, and modifications to the Articles of War. But they eventually expanded to demand that the King dissolve Parliament and make peace with France. That may have been asking a little bit too much. The Admiralty countered with an offer of a pardon and only the concessions that had already been made at Spithead in return for the mutineers returning to duty. A fleet of 50 loyal ships moved to prevent the mutineers from sailing up the Thames onto the City of London, but the mutineers were able to blockade London. One of the concerns in the Admiralty was that the mutiny at the Nore may have been politically motivated, as apart from the Spithead mutiny, which was much more about pay and conditions, which generally many thought were quite unfair anyway. The mutineers were denied food and water, and Parker decided that he would sail his ships to France. When he hoisted flags to signal for that to occur, all of the remaining ships refused to follow. One of the ships, HMS Clyde, was convinced by its captain that they should leave the mutiny, and so it sailed off. This was seen as a sign for the others, and the mutiny collapsed. Parker, convicted of treason, was hanged at the yardarm of Sandwich. That was the vessel where the mutiny had started. The Admiralty ended up hanging 29. 29 were imprisoned, and 9 were flogged, while others were submitted to the most heinous of punishments, and that was transportation to Australia. One of those was surgeon's mate William Redfern, who went on to become a respected surgeon and landowner in New South Wales, of which Redfern is named after. These twin mutinies, they weren't the end of discontent within the Navy. And there were multiple instances of ships that murdered their officers and were either sailed into French or Spanish ports. That gives you a little bit of a context of the time in which Nelson and Jarvis were operating and the conditions that they were dealing with the sailors and marines that they had on board their ships. So discipline was a very important part of the role of the captain. Mutinous behaviour had to be dealt with quite severely. And an example of how Jarvis handled these kind of situations was when on HMAS Marlborough, there was a man who was convicted of mutinous behaviour and sentenced to death. However, the men on board the ship refused to carry out the sentence, and the captain didn't do anything to try and enforce it. So Jarvis threatened the captain with replacement, and he had the Marlborough surrounded by other boats, and he threatened to sink the Marlborough. The sailors came to see reason, and the man was duly executed. Jarvis, watching the man swing from the yardarm, turned to the officer standing next to him and said, "Discipline is preserved, sir." For the story of Lord Horatio Nelson, probably the most important played by Jarvis is the fact that he was his patron. Higher in rank, he fully saw the talent and qualities that Nelson brought to the Navy, and he acted as an advisor to Nelson, and he actively supported him in his career. In fact, later, Nelson would return to the Mediterranean fleet under Jarvis, and Jarvis would dispatch him with his own command to hunt down Napoleon for his invasion of Egypt. This would lead to the Battle of the Nile and probably Nelson's greatest victory. He did this above Rear Admiral Sir John Ord, who was senior to Nelson. Ord, significantly miffed by the slight on his capabilities, complained publicly about the way that he'd been treated. Jarvis ordered him to return to England. Ord requested to be court-martialed so that he could clear his name. The Naval Board refused. He requested that Jarvis be court-martialed. Again, the board refused. The board did, however, censure Jarvis for not supporting his subordinate. The situation became so dire that Ord actually challenged Jarvis to a duel, which was illegal at the time. And the king intervened and ordered Jarvis to decline. So the relationship between Jarvis and Nelson is already quite close, and they've served together for quite a while. Jarvis understands what Nelson is like, and he understands his talents and skills. That brings us to the 14th of February, 1797, off the Portuguese coast. It's foggy, but the sun is rising, and it's starting to burn off that fog. A Spanish lookout spots the British fleet. Flags are raised to signal the number of ships in the British fleet. However, little notice is taken of this, so another signal is sent. The signal that the English force consists of 40 sail of the line. The captain afterwards said that he did this to rouse the admiral. It had the effect of perplexing and alarming the whole fleet. The situation is described in Robert Southey's book, The Life of Nelson, and this was written about 10 years after Nelson died. The absurdity of such an act shows what was the state of the Spanish Navy under the miserable government by which Spain was so long oppressed and degraded and finally betrayed. In reality, the general incapacity of the naval officers was so well known. When the probability that Spain would take part in a war as an ally of France was first contemplated, Nelson said that their fleet, if it was no better than it would have acted with an alliance with us, would soon be done for. I'll describe briefly the manoeuvres as they occur, but it's much better if you have a look at this. And we've got some diagrams that have come from the histories, which really do paint a much better picture than I'm going to be able to do, particularly as naval lexicon is not my first language. In the morning, as the fog clears, there's a westerly wind. The British are travelling south in two columns, two tight, compact columns, kind of indicative of the level of training that you would expect from the Royal Navy. The Spanish, not so much. They're travelling in two groups, pretty much column a blob. There's a Weatherly division and a Lee division. The Lee division's got about 6 vessels in it. And they are trying to get back with the Weatherly division, which contains the majority of the Spanish forces. Jarvis's columns are heading down in between the two groups. Jarvis at this stage is unsure of the number of ships that he's actually confronting, but a signal lieutenant describes them as thumpers. And this is because of the fact that one of the ships is 130 guns, significantly bigger than the British ships. That ship, the Santissima Trinidad, is the flagship of Jose de Cordoba. Admiral Jarvis is in the Victory, a first-rate ship with 100 guns. Commodore Horatio Nelson is in HMS Captain. She is a 74-gun third-rate ship of the line. Jarvis is on the quarterdeck of Victory, and he, along with his flag captain, Robert Calder, are counting the ships as they come into view. Calder says, "There are 8 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 20 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 25 sail of the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 27 sail of the line, Sir John." "Enough, sir. No more of that. The die is cast, and if there are 50 sail, I will go through them." Admiral Jarvis's display of bravado may have been to inspire confidence in the officers around him, as it was realised that they were outnumbered 2-1. It may have inspired a little bit too much confidence, because one of them, Captain Benjamin Halliwell, who we'll meet later as one of the band of brothers from the Battle of the Nile, he gets a little bit excited and slaps his admiral on the back and says, "That's right, Sir John, that's right. By God, we'll give them a damn good licking." He managed to survive this shocking display of familiarity with his admiral and went on to command HMS Swiftsure at the Battle of the Nile, a 74-gun ship of the line. This is at about 10:45. At 11, Jarvis gives his order, "Form in a line of battle ahead and astern of Victory as most convenient." So he's now bringing his 2 columns into a line of battle, ready to commence with the Spanish. The 2 groups of the Spanish are attempting to unite, but their formations are quite untidy. In fact, they're a dog's breakfast. The whole point of a line of battle is that the ships can fire out of either side when they are delivering a broadside, and none of their ships are going to get in the way of that. The Spanish Weather Division is in kind of 3 columns, so many of the ships aren't going to be able to fire on the British. At 11:12, Jarvis makes his next signal, engage the enemy, and at 11:30, Admiral intends to pass through enemy lines. Ladies and gentlemen, in what is going to be a cliffhanging end to this episode, we're going to finish off here. I will leave you in suspense. You will not know if Nelson is going to live or die during this battle, if he is going to obey his orders or not, or if the Royal Navy will rule the waves off the Portuguese coast. Hopefully you'll tune in for the next episode, where we will concisely cover the actions that occur during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. You'll find out who wins, who loses, how they win, and importantly, we're going to uncover some of the leadership lessons that there are to be had here.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.